The grand foyer of the park estate didn't just fall quiet, it turned to ice. It wasn't the sound of a shattering vase or a shouted command that did it. It was the sudden, suffocating absence of sound. In the center of the marble floor, beneath the minimalist geometric chandelier, Janice, the high society fiancée of the city's most feared man, had reached her breaking point. Her designer-clad arm was cocked back, a gold-braceleted hand ready to strike the young gardener, Gary, for a mistake he hadn't even made. The entire household stopped breathing. The other maids huddled near the couches, their eyes wide with the familiar terror of what was about to happen. They knew the sting of Janice's palm all too well. But the slap never landed. Nicole, her bright blue uniform a sharp contrast to the neutral tones of the room, had moved with a speed that defied her status. Her fingers clamped around Janice's wrist like a vice, an iron grip hidden beneath a professional exterior. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. "That is enough," Nicole said, her voice a calm blade that cut through the tension. A collective gasp rippled through the staff. Janice's face, usually a mask of rehearsed elegance, twisted into a jagged expression of pure shock and mounting fury. She struggled against the hold, but Nicole's arm remained a rigid power triangle of defiance. Neither woman noticed the figure at the end of the long, gray hallway. Du-Yun stood there in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his arms crossed over his chest. He had just returned, silent and unannounced. For 2 years, he had lived in a carefully curated silence, but in this single, frozen moment, the mask he had accepted as his future wife finally shattered. He saw the cruelty he had been too busy to notice, and the unexpected fire of the woman standing against it. The silence stretched, thin and dangerous as a razor's edge. Janice ripped her arm away, her face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson. "How dare you lay a finger on me?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. Nicole stepped back, smoothing her blue apron with calculated composure. "I apologize if my intervention was firm, ma'am, but Mr. Du-Yun's household protocols are very specific about the professional treatment of all employees." Janice's eyes bulged with rage. She spun around to the trembling staff in the background. "Did you see this? This? Nothing just laid hands on me." Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch. "I want her gone. Someone throw this trash out of my house right now." The air in the sterile hallway fractured with the sharp, whistling arc of Janice's hand, but the expected crack of palm against skin never came. Instead, there was only the dull, heavy thud of bone meeting a palm that felt like forged steel. Nicole's fingers clamped around Janice's wrist midair, her grip so precise and unrelenting that Janice's momentum jerked her entire frame forward. The silence that followed was deafening. Gary, the floor supervisor, stood paralyzed by the service cart, his mouth slightly agape as he stared at the two women. He had seen Janice's tantrums before, but he had never seen anyone, certainly not a subordinate, move with that kind of predatory speed. Janice's face twisted, her eyes wide with a mix of indignation and genuine pain. "Let go of me, you insolent little—" "I wouldn't finish that sentence," Nicole interrupted, her voice a low, vibrating hum that carried more weight than a scream. She didn't look angry, she looked bored, which was infinitely more terrifying. She held Janice's arm aloft like a piece of discarded evidence, her thumb pressing just firmly enough into the radial nerve to send a warning shot of numbness up to the woman's shoulder. A shadow shifted at the end of the corridor. Du-Yun stood there, a silent silhouette against the harsh LED lighting. He didn't move to intervene, nor did he offer a word of comfort. His gaze was fixed on Nicole's hand, his expression an unreadable mask of cold calculation. Finding her voice, Janice wrenched her arm back the moment Nicole loosened her grip, immediately clutching her wrist and shrinking away. "Du-Yun, did you see that? She attacked me. This animal put her hands on me because I caught her stealing from the sweets. She's dangerous." Her voice climbed an octave, tears of practiced frustration welling in her eyes as she looked toward him for the inevitable dismissal of the help. Du-Yun finally stepped forward, the click of his polished shoes echoing like a metronome. He stopped a few feet away, ignoring Janice's outstretched hand. He looked past her, his eyes lingering on the red marks Nicole's fingers had left, and then shifted to the discarded cleaning tray Janice had kicked over moments earlier. "I have been standing in the gallery for 3 minutes, Janice," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I saw the tray, I saw the blow you aimed at her face, and I saw exactly who the animal was." Janice's breath hitched, her face draining of color as the victim narrative collapsed. Du-Yun didn't give her a second look. He turned his attention to Gary, who was still trying to blend into the wallpaper. "The lady is clearly overwrought," Du-Yun remarked, though his tone suggested she was merely an inconvenience. "Take her to the guest wing. She is to stay there until her flight is arranged. And Gary, see that she doesn't find her way back to this floor." The heavy oak door of Du-Yun's private study clicked shut, sealing out the frantic protests of Janice being escorted down the hall. Nicole stood in the center of the room, her posture straight despite the adrenaline still humming through her veins. The scent of cedar and expensive leather filled the space, a stark contrast to the chemical sting of the cleaning supplies she'd been carrying moments ago. She watched Du-Yun as he walked behind his massive desk, his movements fluid and infuriatingly calm. She knew the protocol. She had laid hands on a guest, regardless of the provocation. In his world, that was the ultimate transgression. She expected the cold formality of a termination, perhaps even a non-disclosure agreement pushed across the blotter for her to sign. "You have a remarkable reflex, Nicole," Du-Yun said, finally breaking the silence. He didn't sit. He leaned back against the mahogany, crossing his arms as he studied her with the same detached intensity one might use to examine a piece of complex machinery. "Most people would have flinched. You chose to counterattack." "It was defense, not an attack," Nicole replied, her voice steady even as she anticipated the words, "You're fired." "But I assume you didn't bring me in here to compliment my hand-eye coordination. If you're going to let me go, let's get it over with." Du-Yun tilted his head, a ghost of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, not out of humor, but out of genuine curiosity. "You're remarkably eager to jump to the end of your employment. Is that what you think this is?" "It's what usually happens when the help pushes back," she said, taking a bold step forward. If she was going down, she wasn't going silently. The fear that should have been there was replaced by a sharp, jagged spark of indignation. "But before you hand me my final check, there's something you should know. You think you're in control of this house, but you're failing it. You're failing everyone who works here." Du-Yun's expression shifted, his brow knitting together as his gaze sharpened. "Careful," he warned, though he didn't move to stop her. "No," Nicole countered, her eyes locking onto his. "You allow people like Janice to treat this estate like a playground for their cruelty. You look at numbers, security feeds, and bottom lines, but you've missed the rot. Allowing a guest to strike a staff member isn't just a lapse in hospitality, Du-Yun. It's a failure of leadership. You've let your household become a place where fear is the primary currency, and that starts at the top." The room plunged into a suffocating stillness. Nicole waited for the explosion, for the cold dismissal, but Du-Yun simply stared at her, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight between them. The silence in the study didn't break, it evolved. Du-Yun's gaze didn't waver, but the cold calculation in his eyes seemed to flicker, a momentary glitch in his otherwise perfect composure. He reached for a sleek, glass-surfaced tablet on his desk, his fingers moving with a practiced, lethal efficiency. He didn't call for a security head or a digital forensics team. Instead, he summoned the archive himself, his clearance bypassing the layers of encryption that kept the household's private inner workings hidden from the world. 2 years, Nicole," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "She has been a recurring guest for 24 months. He turned the screen toward her, but his eyes remained fixed on the playback. The high-definition footage began to roll, a grainy but undeniable ledger of systemic cruelty. There was Janice in the solarium 18 months ago, deliberately upending a vase of lilies and watching a terrified maid scrub the pollen from the white silk rug. There was Janice in the kitchen during the winter gala, her mouth moving in a silent, jagged tirade against a server before she ground a stiletto heel into the man's foot. The digital receipts were relentless. The camera angles shifted, jumping through time, revealing a pattern of behavior that thrived in the blind spots of Du-Yun's ambition. He saw Janice cornering staff in the service elevators, her face contorted with a malice that never reached the dining room table. He saw the flinches, the bowed heads, and the quiet, desperate exits of employees who had simply disappeared from his payroll without a word of explanation. As the montage of abuse played out in the blue light of the tablet, the atmosphere in the room shifted from confrontational to funerary. Du-Yun's face remained a mask, but his jaw tightened until a muscle pulsed rhythmically against his skin. He had prided himself on the absolute order of his domain, believing that his silence was a sign of a well-oiled machine. Now, he was looking at the friction he had ignored. He swiped through the last clip, the one from 10 minutes ago. He watched Nicole's arms snap upward, the fluid, defensive grace of her intervention, and the way Janice had instantly transitioned into a weeping victim the moment he appeared in the frame. The contrast was jarring. The reality he had lived in was a fiction, curated by a woman he had trusted to maintain his social standing. He finally set the tablet down on the mahogany surface with a sharp, hollow click. The glowing screen timed out, plunging the desk back into shadow. He looked up at Nicole, and for the first time, the distance between the master of the house and the staff seemed to collapse into something far more dangerous: mutual recognition. "I have spent a great deal of money to ensure I am never lied to," Du-Yun said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, serrated edge. "And yet, I have been blind in my own hallways." The tension in the study was abruptly shattered not by a gunshot or a siren, but by the rhythmic, indignant honking of a horn that sounded suspiciously like a dying goose. Down at the reinforced titanium gates of the estate, a lime-green subcompact car that had seen better decades was currently wedged against the sensors. Mr. Bong, wearing a suit 3 sizes too large and a fedora that sat precariously on his ears, was leaning out of the window, waving a rolled-up trade magazine at the high-definition security cameras. Beside him, Frey sat with his arms crossed, looking as though he were contemplating jumping out of the moving vehicle to escape the sheer second-hand embarrassment. "Open up, I know you're in there, you brooding gargoyle," Mr. Bong bellowed, his voice cracking with the effort of projecting over the intercom. "I am here on a mission of corporate restructuring. You can't hide behind your fancy rocks forever." Inside the monitor room, the security team, still reeling from the revelation of Chief Benson's betrayal, looked at the screen in stunned silence. Du-Yun watched the feed from his desk, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He had prepared for assassins, for federal agents, even for a Mafia hit squad. He had not prepared for Mr. Bong. Against all logic, the gates hummed open. Perhaps the automated system simply didn't recognize the car as a threat, or perhaps the sheer audacity of the intrusion had caused a momentary glitch in the estate's predatory instincts. The little green car sputtered up the gravel driveway, trailing a thin wisp of smoke, and screeched to a halt at the front portico. Mr. Bong tumbled out before the engine had even fully cut, adjusting his lapels with a flourish that suggested he was arriving at the Davos summit, rather than trespassing on a billionaire's private fortress. He stormed into the foyer just as Du-Yun descended the grand staircase, his presence like a splash of neon paint on a monochrome canvas. "You!" Mr. Bong shouted, pointing a stubby finger. "You call this a business? I've seen more efficiency in a soup kitchen. Your staff is crying, your guests are flying, and your security is as porous as a cheap sponge." Du-Yun stopped 3 steps from the bottom, looking down at the man who barely reached his chest. "Mr. Bong," he said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and dawning amusement. "How exactly did you get past the perimeter?" "Perimeter? I told the boy at the gate I was your new efficiency consultant and that his tie was crooked. He was so busy checking his reflection I just drove through," Mr. Bong huffed, planting his hands on his hips. "Now listen to me, you golden boy. You're running this place like a morgue. You need heart. You need soul. You need snacks in the lobby. How can a man think without a bowl of salted peanuts? No wonder your chief is stealing your lunch money. You're too busy looking at the clouds to notice the mud on your shoes." Frey, who had finally shuffled in behind him, looked at Nicole and mouthed a single word: "Sorry." The grand foyer, usually a cathedral of hushed movements and shadows, was now brightly lit and crowded. The staff, from the senior concierges to the junior scullery maids, lined the perimeter like a silent jury. In the center stood Janice, her eyes puffy and her designer silk dress slightly wrinkled from her brief confinement in the guest wing. She still clutched her pride like a shield, her chin tilted up as she spotted Do-yeon descending the final steps. She assumed this was the moment of reconciliation, the public apology she felt her status demanded after the unfortunate misunderstanding, with the help. Do-yeon, darling, she began, her voice a practiced tremolo of wounded elegance. I knew you wouldn't let that person stay in this house over me. We can forget all of this once she's been properly handled. Do-yeon didn't stop until he was inches from her. He didn't look at her face, he looked at her hand. Without a word, he reached out and took her left hand in his. For a heartbeat, Janice's expression softened into a triumphant smirk aimed directly at Nicole, who stood motionless by the pillar. But the smirk died when Do-yeon's thumb didn't caress her knuckles. Instead, he gripped the band of the 5-carat pear-cut diamond, the symbol of their impending union, and slid it off her finger with a cold, mechanical friction. The ring was a contract, Janice, Do-yeon said, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. And a contract requires a baseline of transparency. You failed to mention that your father's textile conglomerate is currently under a liquidation shadow, or that your brother has leveraged your family's remaining assets to cover a $3 million deficit in Macau. Janice staggered back, the color draining from her lips. Those are private matters. They have nothing to do with us. They have everything to do with why you felt the need to treat my staff like subhumans to feel a sense of power, Do-yeon countered. He held the ring up between 2 fingers, the diamond catching the light and casting fractured, jagged reflections across the room. You didn't want a husband. You wanted a vault to hide your family's bankruptcy. You thought that by making everyone else small, no one would notice how hollow your own pedestal had become. He dropped the ring into the palm of her hand. It fell with a dull, heavy click, the sound of a door locking from the outside. The staff, who had lived under the thumb of her erratic cruelty for 2 years, didn't cheer. The silence they offered was far more devastating. It was the silence of a witness who no longer had to fear the defendant. The car is waiting to take you to the airport, Do-yeon said, turning his back on her as if she had already ceased to exist. I've settled your personal debts for the month. Consider it a severance package for a role you were never qualified to play. The echoes of Janice's departure had barely faded from the marble foyer before the digital world began to bleed into the sanctuary of the estate. It started as a localized tremor on social media, a grainy, cropped photo of Nicole's hand clamped around Janice's wrist, captioned with words like assault and unhinged staff. By noon, the tremor had become an avalanche. Janice's father, a man whose empire was crumbling but whose media contacts remained lethally intact, had launched a scorched earth smear campaign. He wasn't just targeting a maid. He was painting Do-yeon's entire household as a den of shielded violence and instability. They're calling her the Maid of Mayhem, Seo-yeon noted, her voice tight as she monitored the rapidly climbing metrics on her screen. The narrative is that you're harboring a violent drifter and allowing her to terrorize high society guests. Her father is threatening a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and he's using every tabloid he owns to turn your reputation into a cautionary tale of new money gone rogue. Do-yeon stood by the window, watching the iron gates where a cluster of paparazzi had already begun to gather like vultures. The irony was sharp. He had finally purged the internal rot, only for the external world to demand its return. The headlines were calculated to hit his most vulnerable point, his professional credibility. In the world of high-stakes finance and mafia-adjacent fund management, instability was a death sentence. Chief Benson, sensing the shifting winds, saw his opening. He didn't come to the study with a plea, he came with a threat. He stood in the doorway, his uniform crisp but his eyes burning with the desperation of a man who had 12 million naira hanging around his neck. "This doesn't go away, Do-yeon," Benson said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The girl is a liability. If you hand her over, if you let me process her and give the press the scapegoat they're screaming for, I can make the father pull the plug on the campaign. I have the leverage. I can fix this." Nicole, standing in the shadow of the bookshelf, felt the cold weight of the room shift toward her. She was the variable that didn't fit, the loose thread that could unravel Do-Yun's carefully constructed world. She looked at Do-Yun, expecting to see the pragmatic businessman who cut losses without hesitation. But Do-Yun didn't look at Benson. He looked at the digital feed of the smear campaign, the lies, the distortions, the weaponized victimhood of a family that had already been exposed as frauds. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, one that made even Benson take a half step back. "You're suggesting I trade a woman who told me the truth for a man who has been robbing me blind?" Do-Yun asked, turning slowly. "The campaign isn't a threat, Benson. It's a confession. They're desperate. And as for you, you've mistaken my silence for a lack of ammunition." The office felt less like a sanctuary and more like an interrogation chamber, the air thick with the metallic tang of ozone from the humming server racks. Chief Benson stood in the center of the rug, his chest puffed out in a final, desperate display of career authority, but his eyes were darting toward the exits. He still believed he held the high ground, that his knowledge of the estate's secrets made him untouchable. He didn't notice Seo-Yun, or Jacqueline, as she was known in the higher tiers of the firm, quietly locking the digital deadbolts on the room's communication array. "The smear campaign is gaining traction, Do-Yun," Benson pressed, his voice straining for a tone of fatherly concern that rang hollow. "The girl has to go. It's the only way to satisfy Janice's father and keep the Mafia's eyes off your ledger. I can facilitate the transfer. One phone call, and she's out of your hair and into a holding cell where she belongs." Do-Yun didn't look up from the tablet. He tapped a single command, and the massive floor-to-ceiling monitors behind him flared to life. They didn't show the news cycle or the frantic tweets of the paparazzi. They showed a series of wire transfers, highlighted in a predatory red, mapping the exact movement of 12 million naira from the estate's contingency fund into a high-stakes gambling syndicate in Lagos. "You're right about the phone call, Benson," Do-Yun said, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on the back of Nicole's neck stand up. "But it won't be to the police, and it won't be about Nicole." Jacqueline stepped forward, her heels clicking with lethal precision on the hardwood. She held a physical folder, a deliberate choice in a digital age, a tangible weight of evidence. 12 million naira, Chief, rerouted through 3 shell companies you set up during the summer gala. You thought the noise of Janice's tantrums would drown out the sound of the vault opening, but you forgot one thing. I built the vault. Benson's face went from a defiant flush to a sickly, gray pallor. He looked at the screen, then at Jacqueline, his mouth working silently. The truth wasn't just a moral victory, it was a mathematical one. Every lie he had told to cover his gambling debts was now indexed, time-stamped, and mirrored on the screens behind his boss. "You're siphoning funds from people who don't believe in courtrooms," Do-Yun remarked, finally standing up. He walked around the desk, his presence filling the room until Benson seemed to shrink into his own uniform. "If I hand this file over to the people whose money you stole, you won't last an hour outside these gates. You didn't just betray me, you became a liability to the very shadows you were supposed to manage." Benson's knees buckled slightly, the weight of the digital receipt finally crushing his ego. The smear campaign against Nicole, the Maid of Mayhem narrative, it all evaporated in the face of his own ruin. He had tried to play a game of shadows against the man who owned the light. "The car is waiting, Benson," Do-Yun said, mirroring the words he had given Janice, but with a far darker finality. "But it's not taking you to the airport. It's taking you to a meeting with the auditors of the funds you've depleted. I suggest you start praying there in a forgiving mood." The sterile, museum-like silence that once defined the estate had been systematically dismantled, replaced by a vibrant, chaotic hum that felt remarkably like life. 6 months had passed since the Great Purge, and the marble floors no longer echoed with the sound of fearful retreating footsteps. Instead, the morning air was thick with the scent of high-grade espresso, and the unmistakable, high-pitched tenor of Mr. Bong's voice drifting from the kitchen. He was currently embroiled in a heated tactical debate with the executive chef over the structural integrity of a traditional omelet, waving a spatula with the authority of a seasoned general while Frey watched from the breakfast bar, nursing a coffee and looking profoundly resigned to his fate. Upstairs, the heavy mahogany doors of the primary study stood wide open, a feat that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Nicole sat at the low table near the window, a stack of logistics reports spread out before her. She no longer wore the starchy, invisible uniform of the help. She moved with a quiet, grounded confidence that had shifted the very axis of the household. She wasn't just the woman who had caught a wrist midair. She was the architect of the new order, the one who had turned a fortress of secrets into a transparent enterprise. Du-Yun stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, watching the sunlight hit the garden where staff members were actually laughing during their break. The tension that used to reside in the set of his shoulders had smoothed out, replaced by a relaxed, watchful grace. He turned as Nicole circled a discrepancy in the quarterly projection, her brow furrowing in that specific way that always preceded a sharp, insightful critique. "You're thinking about the Lagos expansion," he noted, his voice dropping into the intimate, rhythmic cadence they had developed over half a year of shared battles and late-night strategy sessions. "I'm thinking that if we don't fix the supply chain in the Delta, your clean numbers are going to look very messy by December," she countered, looking up to meet his gaze. There was no subservience in her eyes, only the sharp intelligence of a partner who saw the world exactly as it was. Du-Yun walked over, leaning down to look at the figures she had highlighted. The distance between them was negligible now, a space filled with a mutual respect that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and public ruin. He had lost a fiancé and a chief of security, but he had gained something far more valuable, an equal who wasn't afraid to tell him when he was failing his own house. A loud crash echoed from downstairs, followed by Mr. Bong's triumphant shout. "See, I told you the structural tension was off. Too much cheese is a liability, chef." Nicole let out a short, melodic laugh, the sound bright and jarringly human against the expensive backdrop of the study. Du-Yun didn't flinch at the noise. He simply smiled, a real, uncalculated expression, and rested a hand on the back of Nicole's chair. The mansion was finally loud. It was frequently messy, and for the first time in his life, it felt exactly like home.